Train operators of Reddit, what's the strangest creepiest thing you've seen on the tracks? I'm an engineer now, but as a conductor I was walking my train one midnight lacing air hoses getting the cars, freight, ready to pull. I noticed what I thought was a dog or coyote about 100 yards away. No big deal. I have a big aluminum and steel stick with a hook for cranking brakes without having to climb onto the cars. Then I notice it kind of tracing along, pacing me. I could see the glow of its eyes watching me. Later, as we're ready to depart, I'm out in front of the engine opening the track switch to get onto the main line. I'm in the engine's headlights and I hear my engineer say quietly over the radio, calmly walk up to the engine. If I blow the whistle, run. I'm thinking, oh geez, it's just that coyote. No big deal, and I keep working, but he starts flashing the cab lights, so I think maybe there's a manager stalking us, so I go up there. He has me close the nose door and points out a giant mountain lion perched up on a berm 20 feet from where I was. Casually sprawled out, staring dead at us. This was northern Iowa, so pretty uncommon. That and a bunch of junkies and drunks around the yards. 1:30 a.m. in Riverside, California. A very clearly drunk man squares off against my train and then opens his arms like he is accepting what is about to happen. Fell over and got out of the way just before we hit him. Thankfully I have never hit someone yet. But that was the closest I have ever come. It's not the hit or the recovery. It's the nightmares months later. I remember one time a Metro, Chicago area commuter train driver was being interviewed by the news after his train hit a car on the tracks. The reporter asked, "What did you do when you saw the car on the tracks?" His reply was, "I hit the emergency brake. Then got on my phone and called 911. Saw a body wearing a thick coat in the middle of the tracks. We put the train in emergency, but we didn't stop in time. The conductor got out to see if the person was still alive, and it wasn't a person at all. Someone put a ducking coat on a deer carcass and put it between the rails. Weirdest sheet ever." Not an operator, but a girl tried to moon an oncoming train. She was struck and killed. Her parents tried to sue for dangerous conditions. Live next to tracks. Big rig tried to rush across the tracks to avoid waiting. The trucker was fine as the train ran right through the middle of the trailer. It was filled with those 10-cent paper folders. Looked like a Skittles commercial. Rainbow explosion. This could have gone so much worse. I don't know if it counts or not, but I used to do modifications for trains and rewires and then test them and drive them about a mile to terminal that took them and drove them back to where they needed to go. Most of the time we would walk back after dropping them off, since we were hourly and had a private track until where we dropped it off, so there wasn't danger of getting ran over. On the way back there was a big puddle with a decent sized fish swimming in it. There wasn't a lake anywhere on the property and it never flooded for one to swim there. Me and the guy I worked with figured a bird must have dropped it there or someone put it there, because we couldn't imagine any other way it got there. I was a young transportation supervisor trainee for a railroad. It was my first month in intercity Detroit. It was about 3 a.m. and I had to help inspect a train that was having trouble moving. It was winter and the brakes wouldn't release. The guy I was training with dropped me off at one end of the train and I started walking towards the locomotives. About 20 cars into the train I started hearing footsteps on the other side. I would turn my lantern off and wait a few seconds and they would stop. This repeated for about 10 minutes as I walked towards the locomotives. It eventually stopped when I met up part of the train crew. I'm sure it was nothing. Probably a coyote or stray dog. But I was freaked out. When I was 8 years old, obviously not a train operator, I lived close to train tracks in a secluded farm area. One day I was walking along the tracks with a bunch of friends and we see kittens on the tracks. Once we were close enough we could see that many were cut into bits or crushed, while others were left whole in the middle of the tracks but dead as well, likely from shock. There were probably around 8 of them total. They looked to be a month or two old and there was a box next to the tracks. Some sick piece of sheep placed them there and I will never know why, since we never had trouble getting litters of kittens adopted. It was a tough sight and an early lesson on how ducked people can be. Also, on a less depressing note, years later a train managed to lose some cargo from an open bay door or something, scattering umbrellas for a few hundred feet alongside the tracks. Of all the things in the world, it had to be dollar store umbrellas. Most of them were broken too. And of course the one thing that this site always lacks: proof. Imga.com. I've recently qualified as a train driver after a year of training and heard a few stories from other drivers and my own time in the industry that stuck with me. One driver had a jumper that ended up partially in the cab with him. 2, someone ended up pretty much decapitated after getting into a driver's compartment that has a drop window and sticking their head out of it. 3, before coming over I worked in stations. One of the stations had 3 fatalities in 2 weeks. Someone who was jumping over the tracks to change platform when an empty service ran through, and the one that really sticks with me: a mum who walked off the platform into the path of a fast train whilst holding her baby. Not so much strange creepy, but we have third rail here, a live rail carrying 750 DC on the ground that trains pull from to run, and if a badger brushes against it, it gets a bit of a zap. The badger will then turn around and bite down on its attacker, the third rail, and electrocute itself as soon as its jaws close on the rail the DC keeps it clamped on. Not an operator, but this totally counts. My best friend lives on a rural private road that crosses 2 of the most active rail lines in my part of the state. There have been at least 3 accidental deaths from auto train collisions. But a year ago, 2 cars crossed the tracks right before a train. The first car had a middle-aged mom in it. She speeds over the tracks. The second car had her son and his girlfriend, mid-20s. The second car darts in front of the train and is obliterated. NTSB. Sheriff and BNSF arrived to investigate. The mother is hysterical, saying he was right behind me the whole time. They originally thought it was just another unfortunate case of someone trying to outrun the train, until they discovered the mom and son are from a city over an hour away. No one locally knew them. They didn't have permission to be on that private road. And then they found that the girlfriend had been dead for hours. They suspected the mom was helping her murder her son, try to find a dump spot to dispose of the body. Not a locomotive engineer but a train rider. I'm an electrician riding the train for quality control. Coming back from Quebec City, we are riding at approx 50 kph. On a winding curve around a hill we see a lady on a dog sled with her 4 dogs caught on the track. Before I even saw her, the engineers were standing up, screaming obscenities and honking the horn and emergency horn. She managed to pry her sled free and drag the dogs out of the way within mere feet of us hitting her. Not an engineer, and neither is my friend, but he was hit by a train many years ago. This isn't actually his story because he doesn't remember that day. The story comes from the engineer and a farmer who saw it happen. My friend was a plumber on his way to work in his work van. It was cold and his side windows were fogged up. He stopped at the crossing but must not have seen the train coming. The train was only doing about 30 miles per hour. When the train hit the van, it made the van barrel roll on the tracks about 15-20 times before the van finally went off the tracks and settled in a ditch. This was before seat belts, so he was rolling in the van with all the plumber tools and toolboxes. He is just covered in scars but lucky to be alive. The funny part of the story is when the farmer ran to him. My friend ran to the farmer and begged him to help him keep his overalls from falling down. He didn't realize he had just survived getting hit by a train. He was just worried about people seeing him naked. I used to be a shunter for QI years ago. We were reversing a passenger train back onto a platform and had to go over a crossing. I saw a guy stumbling towards the crossing. There was a pub on the other side of the crossing he was trying to get to. He looked at us coming back and decided to run right at the last second as we were already coming through the crossing. I called for the train to stop and jumped off the train to get to him the second he started running as I was watching him, and he got hit by one of the bumpers as the coupler stretched out. He was out cold on the ground with the wheels about 6 inches away from his torso. Holy shit, that one had me rocked for a while. I was told this story by my dad, and sorry, the story was almost 30 years ago so the details are fuzzy. My dad was a motorman engineer for the Chicago Transit Authority. He came home very late one day, which was unusual, and at dinner told me and my mom that some guy was down on the tracks dancing on the third rail, the electrified rail, and this guy, due to being on the tracks, forced my dad to stop his train. While stopped and waiting for the cops. Since my dad already called it into dispatch, the guy was just waltzing around dancing on the third rail in the front of my dad's train. Eventually authorities got the guy, but if he'd made proper contact with the third rail, the guy would have been super dead. Fun fact, my dad radioed in the downtown flood back in the late 80s early 90s. The flood is on one of the modern Marvel's engineering disasters episodes. Was a conductor running the rail from one town to another with a couple of passengers. We went through a tunnel and saw strange creepy lights and heard strange noises. When we got to the next town and I told the station about it, they informed me there was no tunnel on my route. Where the hell did my train go and what the duck did we see and hear? In 1985 my wife and I were traveling across Tanzania to Lake Tanganyika when the train struggled to halt going up a grade in the night. We were the only non-Africans on the train. People started yelling to close the windows. Thieves had put palm oil on the tracks, stopping the train, and were on the roof trying to rob people through the windows. There were a lot of armed soldiers on the train and the thieves quickly disappeared into the night. People walked along and poured sand on the tracks so the train had enough traction to climb the grade past the oil. Not my story, but a colleague. A kangaroo got hit by a train and got stuck in the front coupler. The crew couldn't see it from the cab, so the train drove through the middle of the CBD with half a dead kangaroo swinging from the front of a packed peak time commuter train. My dad worked for the railroad 4 years running a crane truck to fix train cars and derailments. Part of the areas he worked was North and South Dakota. Apparently in a few of the Indian reservations out there it was pretty common for the locals to get drunk in town and walk the train tracks at night and pass out on the tracks. I can't imagine getting drunk enough not to wake up to a train. Then again, I don't think I've ever been drunk enough to pass out outside in winter. Train ran pretty close behind the farm I used to live on. There were these marble-sized, perfectly sphere-shaped iron gonads. My dad said they were from a nasty train derailment right behind our farm when my father was a young child living on the same farm. Nothing creepy about it other than I heard people got hurt during the derailment. As far as I understand it, the sphere-shaped metal gonads were from a mine on the way to a smeltery. They were perfect for using with my slingshot. My dad was a train driver for most of his life. We live in the Netherlands where towns are really close by each other, so a train would go back and forth multiple times a day. Sometimes even every hour. So early one morning, he spots a person sitting near the train tracks. You can't really stop a train, so he radios it in for others to keep an eye out. On the return trip, he slows down as he passes the spot and notices the person is wearing pajamas. It was still very early at that point. On the following pass up again, he slows the train down to crawl and, for sure. So dad stops the train, announces to the early morning commuters that there is a slight technical problem, and gets out to talk to the person. Turns out the person was a patient of the nearby mental institution and was going to plan to commit suicide by train. So dad convinces him not to and takes him back to the institution. He apparently said something like, "Hey, are you missing a patient because I found him or her? I don't remember the gender." He gets back to his train, announces the technical issues are solved and continues working for the day. My dad was a great guy. 14 years old and messing around with a buddy in a train switching yard and figured we would open the back of one of the train cars to see what was in it. Not necessarily to burglarize it, but we figured it would be an adventure. Break the seal, open the doors, and we're immediately buried in literally tons of split peas. Scared the living shit out of us. And we had to swim out from under this 10-foot tall avalanche, which was not easy to do. Literally the closest I'd ever come to death at that point in my life. I've always wondered how our parents would have dealt with their sons being drowned in peas in a rail yard. Not a train operator, but a train mechanic. Anyways, I was inspecting the signaling equipment underneath a locomotive, and on one of the signal pickup bars had a human hand resting on it. We called the police and later found out that the hand was from a man who committed suicide by jumping in front of the train. This engine was several back, so the hand went unnoticed. I worked as a train conductor several years ago. Hitting people or cars always sucked, but as far as strangest creepiest, I caught a freight train from our home terminal to our away terminal in the middle of the night. Along the way we saw something small and black on the track. But it was very small and obviously not moving. Looked like an old trash bag. Maybe cloth or maybe a blown out tire. Nothing out of the usual, people throw crap on the rails all the time. Road switcher crew went on duty the next morning over that section of track. Turns out there was a kid in that jacket. And all the trains that ran that night had went over him without realizing it was a person. Reminded me of what Tom Cruise said in Collateral about a guy dying on a train and nobody noticing until 2 days later. I work on long-haul passenger trains as a conductor. While I usually don't see us hitting things, I've only hit animals thus far. I absolutely hear it if it goes under the train and sends the ballast flying. We hit something a week ago and as usual I heard the ballast. But whatever we hit was flung into the undercarriage right where I was standing. So I felt it. A driver told us he hit a kangaroo but didn't hill it, and it wedged into the front of the train for a couple minutes before being jostled out and under. He said the screaming still gave him nightmares. They also have an axe in their cabin specifically to hill an animal quicker if it's maimed but not outright hilled by the train. Usually only horses and cows have a chance to survive. I work as a driver in Australia. Many years ago on a remote section of track we passed by two cars with headlights on just in the tree line about 40 meters from the track. They appeared to be digging. Didn't occur to me until days later why they may have been digging in the middle of night. In a remote area. Driving through a wildfire. It was right beside the tracks and they closed it down shortly after I went through. Also happened to be the biggest wildfire on record in British Columbia, Canada. Not an operator but I work track maintenance. Our work train had just pulled out of the track next to us while we were working nights one night, so I just decided to stroll down that track alongside where our machines were working. It was a rough town so you always expect junk and booze along the tracks. Figuring I had enough light between machines I went without my headlamp and walked past this lone boot dead center of the track. I remember thinking to myself, some poor homeless guy out there is stumbling around out there bootless. Well, as it turns out, not too much farther down the track our lead machine calls out for a civilian next to our track. After a second or two you hear his voice go cold and we decided to walk up and investigate. Turns out some drunk had been crawling under the work train as it pulled out, dragging and mangling his body pretty badly. His top half was separated. On the lower half one leg was unrecognizable but the other I noticed was missing a foot. Lo and behold, that was the boot I had walked past just moments before. Foot still inside. Kinda creepy that in the dark I had managed to miss a body not 10 feet off the track I was walking on. I use my headlamp every time now. I work for one of the busiest train operators in the UK. Not to get too specific, but 2 months into the job I had a teenage girl jump. I see it coming a mile away, but bombing 100 miles per hour down the main line it was impossible to stop. She pulled her hood over her face and jumped. That was a rough day. Luckily I had a conductor with me who was very supportive until management and police arrived. I carried on with my day. Otherwise I don't think I would have operated a train again. The creepy part in this is the feeling you have knowing what is about to happen and seeing the person's face.